Have you ever wondered what it feels like to die in a foreign land? Can you imagine taking your last breath thousands of miles from the place you once called home? Number 11. Victor Hugo. The French literary giant Victor Hugo fled his homeland in 1851 following Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'état. Hugo had been an outspoken critic of the new ruler, and rather than face potential imprisonment, he escaped to the Channel Islands. First settling in Jersey and later moving to Guernsey, Hugo spent nearly 2 decades in exile. During this period of isolation, Hugo produced some of his most celebrated works, including Les Miserables and parts of La Légende des siècles. His home in Guernsey, Hauteville House, became a creative sanctuary where he wrote standing at a small desk overlooking the sea toward the France he loved but could not return to. Although Hugo eventually returned to France after the fall of Napoleon III in 1870, his exile deeply shaped his worldview and writing. He became a champion for human rights and social justice, themes that permeate his most famous works. When Hugo died in 1885 in Paris, over 2 million people attended his funeral procession, a testament to how completely he had been re-embraced by his homeland after those long years away. Number 10. Frederic Chopin. The Polish composer Frederic Chopin left Warsaw in 1830, just before the November uprising against Russian rule. What began as a musical tour became permanent exile when the uprising was crushed and Poland fell further under Russian control. Chopin settled in Paris, where he became the darling of French high society, giving rare performances in intimate salons rather than large concert halls. Despite his success abroad, Chopin constantly yearned for Poland. His homesickness manifested in his compositions, particularly in his polonaises and mazurkas, which celebrated Polish musical traditions. As his health deteriorated from tuberculosis, Chopin's final wish was for his heart to return to Poland. He died in Paris in 1849, surrounded by friends and students rather than family. Following his request, his body was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, but his heart was removed and smuggled back to Warsaw, where it remains encased in a pillar at the Holy Cross Church, a physical embodiment of his divided existence. Number 9. Napoleon Bonaparte. Few exiles have been as dramatic as Napoleon Bonaparte's banishment to the tiny island of Saint Helena in the South Atlantic. After his defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the British government was determined to place the former French emperor somewhere he could never escape from again. Saint Helena was one of the most remote spots on Earth, a volcanic island just 47 square miles in size, located 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass. Napoleon lived there for 6 years in Longwood House, a damp residence that many believe contributed to his declining health. His days were structured around writing his memoirs, gardening, and chess, all under the watchful eyes of British guards. In 1821, Napoleon died at the age of 51, likely from stomach cancer, though theories about arsenic poisoning have persisted. He was initially buried on Saint Helena, and it took 19 years before the French government secured permission to return his remains to Paris, where they now rest in an elaborate tomb at Les Invalides, a final homecoming for a man who spent his last years gazing at the ocean that imprisoned him. Number 8. Leon Trotsky. Revolutionary leader Leon Trotsky spent the final years of his life in a heavily fortified villa in Mexico City, thousands of miles from the Russia he had helped transform. After losing the power struggle against Joseph Stalin following Vladimir Lenin's death, Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party in 1927 and exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929. What followed was a desperate search for sanctuary. Turkey, France, Norway, each country eventually grew uncomfortable hosting the controversial figure whom Stalin had declared an enemy of the state. In 1937, Mexican artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo helped secure permission for Trotsky to settle in Mexico. From his compound in Coyoacán, Trotsky continued to write political critiques and organize the Fourth International. Despite security measures, Soviet agents eventually succeeded in their mission. On August 20th, 1940, Ramon Mercader, a Spanish communist and NKVD agent, fatally wounded Trotsky with an ice pick to the head. Trotsky died the next day, buried in the garden of his final refuge, never again to see the Russia for which he had sacrificed everything. Number 7. Oscar Wilde. For each man kills the thing he loves. Oscar Wilde's words from The Ballad of Reading Gaol held particular poignancy for the author himself. After his imprisonment for gross indecency in England, the once celebrated playwright emerged from prison in 1897, a broken man. Society had turned against him, his health was poor, and financial ruin meant he could no longer remain in England. Wilde fled to France, adopting the pseudonym Sebastian Melmoth. He spent his final years drifting between cheap Paris hotels and seaside towns, supported by the few loyal friends who hadn't abandoned him. The wit and vivacity that had made him the toast of London society dimmed considerably, though flashes of his brilliance remained. On November 30th, 1900, Wilde died of meningitis in the Hotel d'Alsace, a modest left-bank establishment. His final words reportedly included a comment on the room's wallpaper, "One of us has to go." He was buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery, far from his native Ireland. It wasn't until 2017 that Wilde received a symbolic homecoming when a new memorial to him was unveiled at Dublin's Merrion Square. Number 6. Dante Alighieri. The author of The Divine Comedy experienced the bitter reality of exile firsthand. In 1302, Dante Alighieri was exiled from his beloved Florence due to political conflicts between the white and black Guelphs. Facing a death sentence should he return, Dante spent the remaining 19 years of his life wandering through various Italian courts. During this period of displacement, Dante composed his masterpiece, channeling his anger, longing, and political views into a work that would define Italian literature. Throughout The Divine Comedy, the pain of exile surfaces repeatedly. Dante's ancestor Cacciagata even prophesies the poet's banishment in Paradiso. Dante died in 1321 in Ravenna, where he had found patronage from Guido Novello da Polenta. Florence, realizing too late the genius they had cast out, repeatedly requested the return of his remains. Ravenna refused. Even today, Dante's tomb in Ravenna contains his remains, while Florence maintains an empty memorial in the Basilica of Santa Croce, a lasting testament to the city's enduring guilt over exiling its greatest poet. Number 5. Sigmund Freud. The father of psychoanalysis spent most of his life in Vienna, but his final year was spent as a refugee in London. As Nazi influence grew in Austria, Freud initially resisted leaving, despite the growing danger to Jewish intellectuals. "They would not dare," he reportedly said. By March 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, reality could no longer be denied. Even then, Freud hesitated until 4 of his sisters were arrested. Through international pressure and the payment of a substantial exit tax, Freud secured permission to leave with his immediate family. Many of his extended family members who remained behind later perished in concentration camps. At 82 and suffering from jaw cancer, Freud arrived in London in June 1938. He set up his final home and office at 20 Maresfield Gardens, where he continued to see a few patients and completed his final book, Moses and Monotheism. On September 23, 1939, after years of painful illness, Freud asked his doctor for a lethal dose of morphine. He died far from the Vienna that had shaped his revolutionary theories, his famous couch and collection of antiquities the only familiar surroundings in his final exile. Number 4. Emperor Haile Selassie. The last emperor of Ethiopia's exile began dramatically in 1936 when Mussolini's forces invaded his country. After organizing resistance, Haile Selassie was forced to flee, eventually settling in Bath, England. His powerful speech to the League of Nations, warning that "it is us today, it will be you tomorrow," fell on deaf ears. For 5 years, the Lion of Judah lived modestly in the English countryside, maintaining a small court in exile. When British forces liberated Ethiopia in 1941, Haile Selassie made a triumphant return to his throne, the first exiled leader to be restored during World War II. The irony of Haile Selassie's story is that after surviving this external exile, he later died during an internal one. In 1974, a military coup deposed him. The revolutionary government announced his death in 1975, claiming he had died of natural causes while under house arrest. Decades later, in 1992, his remains were discovered buried under a toilet in the palace, revealing the inglorious end of a man once revered as a living god by Rastafarians and as one of Africa's most significant leaders. Number 3. Karl Marx. The revolutionary philosopher whose ideas would shake the world spent over half his life as an exile in London. After being expelled from his native Germany, then France and Belgium, Marx settled in London in 1849, where he would remain until his death. Marx lived in crushing poverty during his early years in London, surviving largely through financial support from his collaborator Friedrich Engels and occasional journalism work. 3 of his children died during this period, likely due to the poor living conditions in their Soho lodgings. Marx spent days in the British Museum reading room researching his economic theories while his family struggled at home. By the time Marx died in 1883, his circumstances had improved somewhat, though he never saw his revolutionary ideas implemented on a large scale. He was buried in London's Highgate Cemetery, his original grave marked by a modest headstone. Only in 1954 was the current monument with its famous "Workers of all lands, unite" inscription erected. The man whose theories would later inspire revolutions across multiple continents died far from any of the countries where his ideas would later take hold. Number 2. Albert Einstein. When Albert Einstein left Germany in December 1932 for a visiting professorship at Caltech, he had no idea he would never return to his homeland. Just weeks after his departure, Hitler came to power. While Einstein was still in California, Nazis raided his Berlin home and confiscated his sailboat. His books were among those burned in Nazi book burnings. Einstein decided to remain in the United States, accepting a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He renounced his German citizenship and became an American citizen in 1940. Though he escaped the Holocaust that would claim many of his Jewish colleagues and relatives in Europe, Einstein spent the remainder of his life as an emigrant. Despite his scientific celebrity and comfortable position, Einstein maintained a certain detachment from American culture. He lived simply in Princeton until his death in 1955 from an aortic aneurysm. He had requested that his body be cremated and his ashes scattered secretly to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. His brain, however, was removed during autopsy without family permission and became the subject of decades of scientific study, a final indignity for a man who had already lost one homeland to persecution. Number 1. Pablo Neruda. The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda experienced multiple exiles throughout his turbulent life. His first came in the 1940s when, as a communist senator, he criticized President González Videla's government, leading to his escape from Chile across the Andes Mountains into Argentina. During this period of political exile, Neruda completed his epic Canto General, a sweeping poetic history of Latin America. After several years abroad, Neruda eventually returned to Chile, where his international fame as a Nobel Prize-winning poet provided some protection. Neruda's final exile was one of the most tragic. Just days after General Augusto Pinochet's coup overthrew Salvador Allende's government in September 1973, Neruda died in Santiago. For decades, the official cause was listed as heart failure related to prostate cancer. However, persistent rumors that he was poisoned by Pinochet's regime led to the exhumation of his body in 2013. While definitive proof of murder remains elusive, the timing of Neruda's death, just as he planned to flee Chile again, adds a layer of tragedy to his story. His funeral became one of the first public protests against the dictatorship, with mourners defiantly chanting, "Compañero Pablo Neruda, present." He died in his homeland physically, but in a Chile that had become unrecognizable to him, perhaps the cruelest form of exile. Have you ever thought about what these exiles would say to us today? How many brilliant minds are currently creating masterworks in foreign lands, wondering if they'll ever see home again?